Let's get one thing straight from the beginning. In today's world, if you're not posting your face, people start writing your story for you. They assume you're insecure. They assume you're hiding. They assume you're not living much at all. But here's what they don't understand. Some of the most observant, emotionally aware, and mentally active people on the planet are not the ones constantly posting. They are the ones watching, processing, and experiencing life in real time, especially empaths. Because for an empath, life is not something you constantly upload for validation. Life is something you absorb. And when you understand how their mind actually works, you realize something important. Not posting photos isn't absence, it's not insecurity. And it's definitely not emptiness. It's a different operating system, one that prioritizes internal experience over external approval, one that values emotional depth over digital visibility, one that chooses presence in the moment instead of performance for the crowd. So when we talk about the psychology of empaths who don't post their photos, we're not talking about social media habits. We're talking about how they experience identity itself. And once you understand that, you stop misreading their silence and start recognizing the depth behind it. Let's start with something most people completely misunderstand about empaths. They assume empaths are just sensitive people who react more than others. But that's not accurate. What's actually happening is deeper. Empaths are not primarily driven by external validation. They are driven by internal experience. And that changes how they relate to everything, especially social media, especially posting their photos, especially being seen. Now think about how most people build their identity today. It's external. You post something, you wait, and the response tells you what it means. Likes, comments, views, these become signals that shape how you feel about yourself. Over time, it creates a loop. You don't just share to express, you share to confirm your value. But an empath doesn't naturally run that loop in the same way. Inside an empath, the processing system is different. When they experience something, anything, it doesn't immediately become something to broadcast. It becomes something to absorb. They are constantly translating experiences into internal meaning before they even think about external expression. So when you ask, why don't they post their photos? The answer is not simple avoidance. It's prioritization. For them, the internal reaction comes first. Always, let's make this more practical. Imagine an empath takes a photo. For most people, that photo is a potential post. It enters a mental queue. Should I post this? Will people like it? What will they think? For an empath, that same photo enters a completely different space. It becomes part of a personal emotional archive, not a performance asset, but an experience marker. They're not thinking, how will I be seen? They're thinking, what did I feel in that moment? And that shift seems small on the surface, but psychologically it is huge. Because once your focus moves from external approval to internal meaning, your behavior naturally changes. You stop optimizing for attention and start optimizing for authenticity. You stop selecting moments based on how they will perform, and you start valuing them based on how they felt. Now here's where it gets interesting. People often assume that not posting means lack of confidence. Confidence built on external validation is actually very fragile. It depends on response. It depends on feedback. It depends on whether people engage with you or not. Empaths, when they are operating in a balanced state, don't build confidence that way. They build something more stable, self-referential awareness. That means they can evaluate their own experiences without needing outside confirmation. So when they look at their life, they don't ask, is this impressive enough for others? They ask, is this real for me? And that single shift removes a massive psychological dependency. Now, does that mean empaths don't care about people? No, that's another misconception. They care deeply. In fact, they often care too deeply. That's exactly why they are selective with exposure. Because when you feel everything more intensely, you also become more aware of how exposure affects your internal state. A simple post for one person is just content. For an empath, it can be a subtle emotional experience. Anticipation, vulnerability, interpretation of reactions, and internal reflection all at once. That's a lot of processing for something that might not even matter to them personally. So over time, something intelligent happens in their psychology. They start conserving emotional bandwidth. They begin to notice that not everything needs to be externalized. Not every moment needs witnesses. Not every experience needs approval. And this is where internal-driven identity becomes stronger. Because when you stop outsourcing your emotional stability to external responses, you start developing something very rare. Consistency within yourself. You don't rise and fall based on reactions. You don't shift your self-image based on engagement. You don't depend on visibility to feel valid. Instead, you develop a quieter form of certainty. This is why many empaths seem private from the outside. But internally, they are often more active than people assume. They are processing, reflecting, learning, and building meaning continuously. They just don't convert everything into public display. And here's the key point most people miss. In a world where attention is currency, not participating fully in that system can look like absence. But for empaths, it's not absence. It's refusal to let external systems define internal reality. They are not rejecting connection. They are rejecting dependency. Because once you become dependent on external validation to feel okay, you lose something very important: emotional independence. Empaths, especially when self-aware, naturally resist that loss, so they choose a different path: less broadcasting, more experiencing, less performance, more presence, less external measurement, more internal alignment. And that's why, when you look at them from the outside, it can be confusing. You might think they're not showing their life, but from their perspective, they are not trying to show their life. They are trying to live it without constantly translating it into approval-seeking behavior. And that's the real distinction. They are not disconnected from the world. They are just not owned by its feedback loop. Now, this is where the psychology of empaths really starts to make sense in a practical way. When people hear empath, they often reduce it to something vague like feeling more. But that's not precise enough. What's actually happening is a higher level of emotional and sensory processing load. An empath is not just noticing more, they are processing more simultaneously, and often without filtering it out automatically. And that difference is exactly why social media, especially photo sharing and self-exposure, affects them differently than most people. Let's break it down. Every human brain filters information. It decides what matters and what doesn't. Most people have a strong enough emotional filter that allows them to ignore or minimize irrelevant social input. A comment is just a comment. A like is just a tap. A view is just a number. But for many empaths, that filtering system is more permeable. Not weaker, just more open. That means more emotional data gets through. So when they post a photo, they are not just seeing engagement. They are unconsciously processing layers of meaning. Who reacted? How did they react? What does that reaction imply about me? What energy is behind it? Is there judgment? Is there approval? Is there indifference? Even if they are not consciously asking these questions, their nervous system is registering them. And this is where overload begins. Because what looks like a simple post on the surface is actually a multi-layered emotional environment underneath. Now imagine that multiplied over time. One post is manageable. 10 posts is stimulating. Hundreds of interactions becomes a constant background processing load. For an empath, that can quietly become exhausting, not because social media is inherently bad, but because their internal system doesn't naturally shut off emotional input as quickly as others do. So instead of just posting a photo, they are entering a space where their emotional awareness is constantly activated. This is important. Emotional overload is not always dramatic. It's not always anxiety or panic. Often it is subtle depletion. They might not even realize it at first. They just start feeling more tired after being online, more mentally scattered, less grounded, less present in real life. And that's when the pattern changes. They start associating exposure with fatigue. Now here's the key psychological mechanism behind it. Empaths tend to have high emotional empathy and high situational awareness. That means they don't just feel their own emotional state, they also pick up emotional cues from others. In person, this can be manageable because context is clear. You can see facial expressions, tone, body language. But online, especially through photos and comments, those cues become fragmented. A comment might be neutral, but it can be interpreted multiple ways. A like is ambiguous. A lack of response feels like absence. A strong response can feel like pressure. So the brain starts filling in gaps. And when the brain starts filling in emotional gaps, it often does so in a way that increases load, not reduces it. That's how overload builds quietly. Now connect this back to posting photos. When someone posts their image, they are not just sharing appearance. They are triggering social evaluation. And for most people, that's manageable because their emotional system treats it as low stakes. But for empaths, the stakes feel higher internally, even if they know logically that it shouldn't matter. That mismatch between logic and emotional processing is where fatigue comes from. They might think it's just a photo, but their system is processing it as, I am now visible to interpretation. And interpretation means uncertainty. And uncertainty is one of the biggest drivers of cognitive and emotional load. So over time, something very logical happens. They begin to reduce exposure, not because they are afraid of people, not because they dislike attention, but because their system naturally seeks equilibrium. If something consistently creates internal noise, they reduce it. That is not avoidance. That is regulation. Think of it like this. Some people can sit in a loud environment for hours and feel fine. Others get drained after a short time and need silence to reset. Neither is wrong. It's just different thresholds for sensory and emotional input. Empaths often fall into the category of lower tolerance for prolonged emotional stimulation, not because they are weak, but because they process it more deeply. Now here's an important distinction. Emotional overload does not mean emotional instability. In fact, many empaths appear very composed externally. That's because they are constantly self-managing internally. They learn to regulate by controlling input, not by reacting to output. So instead of constantly processing incoming social feedback, they start limiting the channels through which that feedback enters. And social media is one of the easiest channels to regulate. They can choose not to post. They can choose not to engage. They can choose when to expose themselves emotionally. And that control becomes powerful because once you recognize what drains your system, you naturally start protecting it. Now from the outside, people might misinterpret this as withdrawal, but internally it's clarity. They are not disconnecting from life. They are optimizing their emotional bandwidth. They are choosing depth over stimulation, presence over exposure, stability over constant social input. And here's the part most people miss entirely. When empaths reduce emotional overload, they don't become less engaged with life. They often become more engaged with reality itself. They notice more in conversations. They feel more in experiences. They are less distracted by digital noise, so their attention becomes sharper in the real world. So while others are distributing their emotional energy across hundreds of micro interactions online, empaths are concentrating it into fewer, more meaningful experiences. And that creates a very different quality of life. Less constant stimulation, but more clarity. Less exposure, but more depth. Less noise, but more awareness. That is the real psychology behind it, not avoidance, but intelligent reduction of emotional overload to preserve internal stability. This is where most people completely misread empaths. When someone doesn't post their photos, doesn't share their life constantly, or stays quiet online, the default assumption is simple. They're avoiding attention. But that interpretation is surface level. For an empath, privacy is not avoidance. It's regulation. And there's a big difference between the two. Avoidance is driven by fear, fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of being seen. Regulation is driven by awareness. Awareness of what maintains internal stability and what disrupts it. Empaths are not trying to disappear from the world. They are trying to stay balanced within it. Now let's make this real. Think about how emotional systems work. Every person has a threshold for stimulation, emotional, social, and cognitive. When that threshold is exceeded, the system doesn't instantly crash. It starts to compensate. It becomes tired, reactive, distracted, or overwhelmed. Empaths tend to hit that threshold faster because they process more input per experience. Not more experiences, more depth per experience. So what does the mind naturally do when it recognizes overload patterns? It reduces exposure to the source. And in today's world, one of the most consistent sources of emotional exposure is being publicly visible online. Posting photos, sharing updates, being perceived, it all creates micro-level emotional activation. Even if nothing bad happens, the mind is still in a state of anticipation and interpretation. How will this be received? Who is looking? What does this say about me? What am I inviting into my space by sharing this? Most people don't consciously articulate these thoughts, but empaths often feel them more intensely in the background. So over time, privacy becomes a natural solution, not a strategy, but an instinctive adjustment. Now here's the key psychological insight. Privacy gives control over emotional input, and control is what reduces cognitive load. When you are constantly visible, your nervous system stays partially on. Not in a dramatic way, but in a low-level scanning mode. You are always in some form available for interpretation. For empaths, that state is draining over time. So privacy becomes a way to turn the system off when it's not needed. It's not about hiding identity. It's about reducing unnecessary activation. Let's compare two modes of living. In one mode, you are constantly broadcasting. Every experience has a potential audience. Every moment carries the weight of interpretation. Even neutral events can become socially charged because they are being observed. In the other mode, most experiences remain internal. They are lived, felt, processed, and stored without external conversion. Empaths naturally lean toward the second mode, not because they reject people, but because they value internal coherence more than external display. Now here's something deeper. When a person is constantly exposed socially, their identity starts to fragment into perception management. They begin to unconsciously adjust behavior based on imagined audience reactions. This creates subtle internal tension. You are no longer just living. You are curating. Empaths are particularly sensitive to this shift. They can feel when behavior is becoming performative. And when they detect that, they instinctively pull back, not because performance is bad, but because it creates internal noise. And empaths are highly sensitive to noise. So privacy becomes a filter, a way to separate what is lived from what is displayed. This is where emotional regulation becomes intelligent rather than reactive. Instead of constantly managing emotional reactions after exposure, they reduce exposure in the first place. That's efficiency, not avoidance. Now let's address something important. People often confuse privacy with insecurity because they are viewing it through a social validation framework. In that framework, visibility equals confidence. So lack of visibility must mean lack of confidence. But that logic only holds if your confidence depends on external reinforcement. Empaths often move away from that dependency. They start building what you could call internal referencing, meaning they evaluate their experiences internally before seeking external feedback, if they seek it at all. So when they choose not to post, it's not because they are afraid of being judged. It's because they are no longer oriented around needing judgment to validate experience. They don't need the external mirror to confirm reality. They already experienced it directly, and that changes the emotional structure completely. Now here's something most people miss. Privacy doesn't just reduce stress. It preserves meaning. When everything is shared, everything becomes slightly diluted. The act of sharing turns experience into content, and content is consumed differently than lived experience. Empaths instinctively sense this dilution, so they protect certain experiences from becoming public artifacts. Not because they are secretive, but because they want to preserve emotional purity. A moment felt privately often carries more depth than a moment performed publicly. So privacy becomes not just protection from overload, but protection of meaning itself. And over time, this becomes a stable internal pattern. Less broadcasting, more experiencing, less performance, more presence, less external reaction management, more internal alignment. From the outside, this can look like distance, but internally it is often the opposite. It creates closeness with one's own experience, because when you are not constantly converting life into external output, you are fully inside it. And that is the core of emotional regulation for empaths, not suppression, not avoidance, but selective exposure. They don't shut the world out. They simply control how much of it enters their emotional system at once. And that control is what allows them to stay grounded in a world that constantly pushes for visibility. This is the part of the psychology that most people overlook completely. And it's also the reason empaths are so often misunderstood in a social media-driven world. When someone is not constantly posting, not uploading their life, not sharing their face every few days, the assumption is usually simple. They're not doing much. But that assumption is built on a digital bias, believing that if something isn't visible online, it isn't happening at all. For empaths, that couldn't be further from the truth. Their life is not absent. It's just not converted into content. And that difference changes everything about how they move through the world. Let's break it down. Most people today split their attention between two layers of reality: the lived experience and the documented experience. They are not just attending events, they are mentally framing them for future posting. A meal is not just a meal, it's a possible photo. A trip is not just a trip, it's a potential story. Even emotional moments are often processed with an audience in mind. Empaths tend to resist that split. They don't naturally divide experience into what is happening and how will this look online. They stay closer to the raw version of reality, the unfiltered, unperformed version. So when they are present in a moment, they are actually in it, not partially observing it from the outside while documenting it, but fully immersed in it as it unfolds. And that creates a different kind of life experience. Now here's where the psychological distinction becomes important. Digital-focused living trains the mind to prioritize representation over presence. You start evaluating experiences based on how well they translate into social currency: likes, engagement, attention. Over time, that subtly shifts attention outward. But real-life focused living does the opposite. It pulls attention inward into direct experience. Empaths naturally lean toward that inward pull. They are more likely to notice the tone of a conversation than the potential caption of a photo. More likely to feel the atmosphere of a place than to think about how it will appear online. More likely to process emotional meaning than visual presentation. This is not a lack of awareness. It is a different direction of awareness, and that direction matters. Because where attention goes, experience follows. Now let's go deeper into what this means psychologically. When someone is not constantly documenting their life, they are not fragmenting their attention. They are not repeatedly stepping outside of experience to evaluate how it looks from the outside. That keeps their emotional presence intact. And emotional presence is powerful. It allows for deeper memory formation, stronger emotional imprinting, and more grounded awareness of self. Empaths often build identity through this internal accumulation of experience rather than external validation of it. So instead of saying, "this happened and people saw it," they form identity through, "this happened and I felt it fully." That might sound subtle, but it's actually a fundamental difference in how identity is constructed. One is socially reflected identity. The other is internally integrated identity. Now here's another layer most people don't consider. Real-life focused people are less distracted by audience perception while living. When you are not constantly thinking about how something will be received, your cognitive load decreases. You are no longer splitting attention between experience and evaluation. For empaths, who already process emotional detail more deeply than average, this reduction in split attention is significant. It allows them to stay fully engaged in what is actually happening. And that creates something rare in modern life: uninterrupted presence. Let's make this practical. An empath at dinner with friends is not thinking about angles for a photo. They are reading tone, energy, emotional shifts in conversation, and the subtle dynamics between people. An empath on a walk is not thinking about capturing the scenery. They are absorbing the atmosphere, temperature, emotional response, and internal state changes that come with being there. An empath in a meaningful conversation is not mentally curating it for later. They are inside it, fully responsive to what is being said and felt in real time. That is real-life focus, and it creates depth that is often invisible from the outside, because what is deeply experienced is not always loudly displayed. Now here's where misunderstanding happens. People who are heavily digital-focused often interpret lack of documentation as lack of experience. If it wasn't posted, it didn't matter. If it wasn't shared, it wasn't significant. But empaths operate outside that framework. For them, significance is not measured by visibility. It is measured by internal impact. A moment can be life-shaping without ever being posted. A conversation can change perspective without ever being recorded. An experience can become part of identity without ever becoming content. And because of this, their life is often richer internally than it appears externally. But richness that isn't displayed is often misread as emptiness. That's the misunderstanding. Now let's talk about another important aspect: emotional continuity. When you constantly shift between experience and documentation, there is a subtle fragmentation of attention. You are never fully in one mode. You are switching between living and presenting. Empaths avoid this fragmentation by default. They tend to stay in one mode: experience. And that creates continuity. Their emotional states are less interrupted by external performance demands. Their awareness flows more smoothly from moment to moment without the constant interruption of, "How does this look?" This continuity strengthens internal clarity. They are not constantly resetting their identity based on feedback loops. They are building it through lived accumulation. And over time, that creates something very stable, a self that is not dependent on external observation. Now here's the final and most important insight. Real-life focus is not about rejecting technology or rejecting social media. It's about hierarchy of attention. For empaths, real experience comes first. Digital expression comes second, or sometimes not at all. They do not deny the existence of social platforms. They simply do not let those platforms define the value of their experiences. So while others are documenting life to feel it, empaths are feeling life to live it. And that difference is everything. Because at the end of the day, a life built for display and a life built for experience will always feel different from the inside. And empaths choose the one that feels more real, even if it is less visible. So now step back and look at the full picture. An empath who doesn't post their photos isn't disconnected from life. They're just not living life through the lens of constant approval. They're not building identity through visibility. They're building it through experience. And that changes everything. Because while a lot of people are busy managing how they are perceived, empaths are often focused on something far quieter, but far deeper. How they actually feel within themselves when no one is watching. That's not avoidance. That's not insecurity. That's awareness. They've simply learned, sometimes unconsciously, that too much external exposure creates internal noise. And instead of adapting their personality to survive that noise, they reduce the noise itself: less performance, more presence, less broadcasting, more experiencing, less dependence on reaction, more stability in self. And here's what most people eventually realize when they look closely. A life doesn't become meaningful because it was seen. It becomes meaningful because it was fully lived. So if someone chooses not to turn every moment into content, don't mistake that for absence. It might actually be the opposite. They're not stepping away from life. They're stepping fully into it.